Hi guys, today I'm going to discuss the blood supply of brain. It is indeed a very important topic with respect to your subjective examinations and also from the competitive exam point of view. So let's dig into it. So now when we talk about the blood supply of brain, there are major two arteries which are responsible for supplying the entire brain. For the anterior circulation, we have the internal carotid artery, and for the posterior circulation, we have the vertebral artery. So now first we'll start by discussing the internal carotid artery. The internal carotid artery itself is a branch of common carotid artery. Common carotid artery in the neck gives rise to an external carotid artery and the internal carotid artery. External carotid artery is responsible for supplying the head and the neck region, whereas the internal carotid artery is responsible for supplying a major chunk of brain. This is how it looks. Here, as you can see, that carotid artery or the common carotid artery which there is, it divides in the neck and terminates by giving two branches. One, the external carotid artery which has branches in the neck and also supplies the head, whereas the internal carotid artery which has no branches in the neck but it supplies a major part of the brain. Now we can see that now we will see the internal carotid artery and its route in the case. Now we'll discuss the course of internal carotid artery inside the neck to the brain. First is the cervical part. This part is responsible for the region in the neck. Here it gives no branches. The second is the petrous part, which travels in the carotid canal present in the petrous part of the temporal bone and is responsible for giving rise to some bony branches. The third part is the cavernous part, which travels inside the cavernous sinus. Here the carotid artery takes a turn and is referred to as carotid sinus. Here it gives rise to n number of branches, for example hypophyseal branch, the meningeal branch, the dural branch, etc. The fourth part is the cerebral part, which enters after piercing the arachnoid matter and it enters the subarachnoid space to give rise to some branches. Now let's see the branches of the fourth part of the internal carotid artery. So the first artery which gives rise after exiting the cavernous sinus is the ophthalmic artery. It is the first branch of the fourth part of the internal carotid artery. Other branches supplying the brain are the anterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, the anterior choroidal artery, and the posterior communicating artery. Anterior choroidal artery is referred to as the artery of the cerebral hemorrhage because it is very much common cause of causing a cerebral hemorrhage in a basal ganglia, namely the putamen. Now we'll talk about the vertebral artery. Vertebral artery itself is a branch of the subclavian artery. Vertebral artery, for name purpose, we are given four parts of the vertebral artery. The first part is responsible for giving rise to some muscular branches. The second part is when it travels from C6 to C1 vertebra in the foramen transversum of the C6 cervical vertebra to C1 cervical vertebra and it gives rise to some spinal branches. The third part again is responsible for giving rise to some muscular branches. Fourth part is where it enters the foramen magnum and it pierces the arachnoid matter to enter the subarachnoid space and unites with another vertebral artery to give rise to the basilar artery. This fourth part of the vertebral artery gives rise to some amazing and major branches. For example, the anterior spinal artery responsible for supplying anterior two-thirds of the spinal cord and the posterior spinal artery responsible for supplying posterior one-third of the spinal cord and some part of medulla. It also gives rise to posterior inferior cerebral artery, also referred to as spica, which is also the largest branch of the vertebral artery. The other branches are the medullary branches and the meningeal branches. The meningeal branches is the one that supplies the dura mater of the posterior cranium. So let's now talk about this image showing the ventral aspect of the brain, showing the major blood supply of the brain. The one thing I need to talk about is that these major arteries of the blood supplying the brain, they are present in the subarachnoid space. One important clinical application of them present in subarachnoid space is that when the blood vessels of these brain have aneurysm and when this aneurysm ruptures, famously known as the Berry's aneurysm, when this Berry's aneurysm ruptures, it often gives rise to a hemorrhage, that is the subarachnoid hemorrhage. The subarachnoid hemorrhage is very important because it is also referred to as the worst headache of the life and also known as a thunderclap headache. And now we know that why berry aneurysm rupture gives rise to a subarachnoid hemorrhage, because the major blood supply of the brain exists in the subarachnoid space. Here we can clearly see that there are two circulations. One is the anterior circulation. The anterior circulation is comes from the internal carotid artery, when the internal carotid artery gives rise to some branches, and the posterior circulation comes from when the two vertebral arteries fuses to form the basilar arteries, and then it gives rise to some branches. Let's not panic, and now we'll see this diagram in great detail, like here. Now we'll talk about the blood supply of brain in a detail. Here first we are concerned about the posterior circulation, which arises when the two vertebral arteries of the left and the right side fuse to form a basilar artery. But one thing to notice is that the two vertebral arteries give rise to two branches which fuse together to form the anterior spinal artery and descend downwards to supply anterior two-thirds of the spinal cord and an anterior part of medulla. And now we can also see that vertebral artery also gives rise to posterior inferior cerebral artery, which is the largest branch of the vertebral artery and supplies the lateral part of the medulla. And then we can actually recall that there is a syndrome known as the Wallenberg syndrome, which also is referred to as the lateral medullary syndrome, is because of the thrombosis in the posterior inferior cerebral artery, because now we know that the posterior inferior cerebral artery is responsible for supplying the lateral part of the medulla. So when we study the blood supply of brain, many stroke syndrome and the brainstem syndromes become automatically clear, because now we know that which artery is responsible for supplying the which particular portion of the brain. Now we'll see that when the two vertebral arteries they ascend and come at the level of the pontomedullary junction, they fuse to form the basilar artery. The basilar artery ascends in front of the pons till the top of the pons. The basilar artery's first branch is the anterior inferior cerebral artery. Anterior inferior cerebral artery is responsible for supplying pons as well as cerebrum. It supplies pons and cerebellum. It also responsible for giving rise to labyrinthine artery. It is a very important and a prominent NEET PG question. And now we see that the basilar artery also gives rise to some paramedian branches and some lateral branches which supply the pons. And then before terminating, it gives rise to a branch known as the superior cerebral artery, responsible for supplying superior half of cerebellum. And now at the top of the pons, it terminates to form the two posterior cerebral arteries. The posterior cerebral arteries circulation is very important, because it is important in forming the circle of Willis. One thing I would really like to put emphasis on is the third nerve originates between the posterior cerebral artery and the superior cerebral artery, and hence can be compressed between these two structures. Now we'll talk about the anterior circulation. Now we will focus on the anterior circulation of the brain, which comes from from the two internal carotid arteries, from the left and the right internal carotid arteries. The internal carotid arteries give rise to a posterior communicating branch which run backwards and completes the arch by joining the posterior cerebral artery and responsible for continuation of the anterior and the posterior circulation. In the front, it gives rise to anterior cerebral artery. The two anterior cerebral arteries of the left and the right sides are joined by a branch known as the anterior communicating artery. And the one artery which runs off to the superolateral surface of the brain is the middle cerebral artery. It is responsible for supplying major chunk of the superolateral surface of the brain and is present in the sylvian fissure. I'll show this picture later in detail. Now we'll talk about the very important and the very famous Circle of Willis. We all know about and all have heard about Circle of Willis, and now we'll also talk about what Circle of Willis is and its importance. The circle formed here is known as briefly as Circle of Willis, But why is Circle of Willis so important? Circle of Willis is very important because it helps in providing a collateral circulation between the anterior and the posterior part of the brain, so thus protecting against ischemia. So if any posterior circulation vessel is suffering from ischemia, then it can automatically be covered from the anterior part of the circulation. So that's why Circle of Willis is very important, because surviving the brain is very important structure and is very critical for life saving functions, for example like respiration, circulation, etc. Circle of Willis contributions are very important because they are ultimately responsible for forming Circle of Willis. As we can clearly see that Circle of Willis here is formed by the anterior communicating artery, written anterior communicating artery, then anterior cerebral artery, written as the anterior cerebral artery, and then the internal carotid artery, written as internal carotid artery, and the posterior communicating artery, written as posterior communicating artery, and the posterior cerebral artery from the posterior circulation, and the tip of the basilar artery being the most posterior point. So this is how the Circle of Willis is formed, and its contributions are very important and are often asked in the NEET PG questions. It was an all India question in the PG that which of the following is not a part of Circle of Willis. The options were the internal carotid artery, the anterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, and the posterior cerebral artery. As we can easily see that middle cerebral artery runs off on the superior lateral surface of the brain and is not at all responsible for giving any contribution to Circle of Willis, so middle cerebral artery is the answer. It was a very easy question, but people got confused and got it wrong. So we should be very clear about the concepts and not try to escape these things, which are very easy if remembered correctly. Now we see that this is a cadaver, as this is an image from the cadaver, and it also represents the ventral aspect of brain. I have taken this image to exactly clear your doubts, so that when you encounter a question in your subjectives, in your practicals, and also in competitive exams, and when you have when your blood supply looks like this and still you are able to identify the blood supply. So let me start by identifying the two vertebral arteries. We can easily identify that these are the two vertebral arteries, right? And now we have this basilar artery. The one which ascends in front of the pons is the basilar artery. Now it gives rise to two arteries. This one is a superior cerebral artery, superior cerebellar artery, and the other one that is responsible for termination of the basilar artery is the posterior cerebral artery. We can easily see that the one connecting the anterior and the posterior circulation here is the posterior communicating artery. And the one responsible this is the internal carotid artery. And the one going anterior is the anterior cerebral artery. And the one running on the outside surface of the brain is the middle cerebral artery. Now by studying this diagram in so much detail, we can easily find out the branches in this complex diagram. So let's not confuse when a cadaver image is shown to you, and please try to remember all your basics and everything will be super clear to you guys. Now after focusing on the Circle of Willis and the different cadaver and the ictal images, now we'll focus on the blood supply of the surface of the brain. As we all know that there are three surfaces of the brain. The outer surface is the supralateral surface, the inner surface is the medial surface, and the most inferior surface is the inferior surface of the brain. I can first of all be very clear to you guys that this is two cerebral hemispheres if we are talking about, and if this is the corpus callosum, the surface, the top which this is here is a supralateral surface, and the surface inside is the medial surface, and the surface inferior is the inferior surface. So this is how we'll proceed about it. So when we talk about the supralateral surface is majority supplied by the middle cerebral artery, as can also be seen by the blue color key. The very broad strip on the superior surface, on the superior side, is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, and a broad strip posteriorly is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery, but the major chunk is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery here runs in the sylvian fissure and on the superolateral surface of the brain and divides into two divisions, the superior division and the inferior division. The superior division supplies the frontal and the parietal part of the brain, and the inferior division is responsible for supplying the temporal part of the brain. Now we'll see the medial surface. As we can see, the medial surface, the major artery responsible in the medial surface is the anterior cerebral artery, and the small part is also supplied by middle cerebral artery, and the posterior part is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. But the major artery on the medial surface is the anterior cerebral artery, and the major artery on the superolateral surface is the middle cerebral artery. And on the inferior surface of the brain, as we can clearly see, it is a posterior surface artery, and small parts are supplied by the anterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery. So now we can say that the blood supply of the surface of brain is very clear to us by these amazing diagrams. Now we'll talk about the blood supply of the coronal section of the brain. So when we take a coronal section of the brain, only a small medial strip of brain is supplied by anterior cerebral artery, and the major superolateral surface of the brain and the surface deep is supplied by the MCA, by its superior division and by its inferior division, and the some inner part of it is supplied by the deep branches of the MCA, which includes the caudate and some level of the putamen. PC is responsible for supplying the innermost area, which includes thalamus mainly, and the anterior coronal artery is responsible for supplying putamen and some areas of the internal capsule, and is also referred to as the artery of the cerebral hemorrhage because it is very much commonly seen rupture in the case of hemorrhages. And only the inferior portion, as we have already seen, is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Now we'll talk about the blood supply of cerebellum. Blood supply of cerebellum can be easily studied by saying that if we divide cerebellum into two parts, firstly, the superior part of the cerebellum is completely supplied by the superior cerebellar artery, and the inferior part of the cerebellum is then supplied by anterior and the posterior halves. The anterior part of the inferior part of the cerebellum is supplied by anterior inferior cerebellar artery, and the inferior posterior part is supplied by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. As this diagram is quite evident and quite clear of the demarcation and the bifurcations of the arterial supply of the cerebellum. Now we'll talk about the blood supply of the medulla. The anteriormost portion of the medulla is supplied by the anterior spinal artery, and the lateral portion of the medulla is majorly supplied by posterior inferior cerebral artery, and the most posterior portion of the medulla is supplied by the posterior spinal artery. And the paramedial and the lateral region is supplied by the direct branches from the vertebral artery. Anterior spinal artery thrombosis give rise to medial medullary syndrome, causing problems in pyramids, hypoglossal nerve, etc. We'll discuss these brainstems and brainstem with stroke syndromes later in next video. And the posterior inferior cerebral artery thrombosis will give rise to lateral medullary syndrome or the Wallenberg syndrome. Medullary syndrome or the Wallenberg syndrome, giving rise to crossed hemianesthesia, Horner syndrome, etc. Now we'll see the blood supply of pons. Pons is majorly supplied by the basilar artery, its medial and its lateral branches, and bits are also supplied by anterior inferior cerebellar artery and the posterior cerebral artery. Midbrain is but majority supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Last but not the least, we are going to talk about the very important blood supply of internal capsule. I have simplified the blood supply of internal capsule in a way that if you read this diagram carefully, then you won't be needing any additional text, and this is very important for your subjective and for your objective point of view. So let's see. Here I have drawn the internal capsule, and here I have drawn the different parts of internal capsule, which are as follows, which everybody knows. The first part is the anterior limb. The crossing here is known as the genu. The next part is the posterior limb. Now the most posterior part is the retrolentiform, and the part just inferior to the retrolentiform is another sublentiform. Different fibers pass through different parts of the internal capsule, and thus the function of each part of internal capsule is very important. For example, genu is concerned with the carrying of the corticonuclear fiber of the face, and the posterior limb is important for carrying the corticospinal tract of rest of the body, and hence every part of internal capsule has very important function. So let's get started. As we can see that anterior limb and the genu of the internal capsule is supplied by this artery known as the recurrent artery of Hubner, which is also referred to as a medial striate artery, is actually a branch of anterior cerebral artery. And Geno is also supplied by an artery known as a Charcot artery, which itself is a branch of a middle cerebral artery, which itself is a branch of internal carotid artery. Now we'll talk about the posterior limb. Posterior limb is supplied by a branch of Charcot artery by anterior choroidal artery, which is itself is a branch of internal carotid artery, and is also supplied by some branches of posterior cerebral artery. Now we'll talk about the retrolentiform part. Retrolentiform is supplied by branches of PCA, and the sublentiform is also supplied by PCA. So this is how this blood supply of internal capsule goes, and please remember it is very important for your subjective and objective point of view. Now I'll be discussing about aneurysm. But what is aneurysm? Aneurysm is a focal dilatation of the arterial wall because of the weakening of the wall tissue causing an abnormal pouching. This is how a normal arterial wall looks like. But aneurysm happens when there is a weakening and thus there is a focal dilatation of the vascular wall causing abnormal outpouching, and this abnormal outpouching is known as aneurysm. This abnormal outpouching is prone to rupture and hence can cause a very serious and life-threatening hemorrhage. The classical example of an aneurysm in the case of brain circulation is Berry aneurysm, which is very commonly seen in the circle of the Willis in relation to anterior communicating artery. In relation with the anterior communicating artery, the most common location is the anterior communicating artery location, and when it ruptures it causes bleeding, and hence, as we all know, that circle of Willis is located in the subarachnoid space. It causes the very deadly subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is also referred to as the worst headache of the life and is associated with some focal neurological deficits also.